Welcome to the first of my videos on eating disorders. So having looked at eating behaviour, categorised by obviously kind of normal eating behaviour, we're now going to move on to looking at the eating disorders. And I'm going to focus primarily on anorexia nervosa, although in this section of the specification you can look at anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, or obesity and overeating, but I'm going to focus primarily on anorexia nervosa. So linking this back to the spec then, as I said, we've already looked at eating behaviours and looked at kind of the factors that influence eating behaviours, looked at culture, mood, health, and then we looked at dieting as well. We then moved on to kind of looking at the biological underpinnings of eating behaviour, particularly neural mechanisms, and the evolutionary explanations to food preference in terms of high calorific food. So if you see then we're looking at the bottom section of the specification here, and you need to know something about an eating disorder. And again, as you see there, it says either anorexia nervosa or bulimia nervosa or obesity. So I'm going to focus on anorexia nervosa. So this video, we're going to look at the psychological explanations, and then we'll finish off next lesson by looking at the biological explanations of this eating disorder. Okay, so first thing then, and obviously I have up there in the top right hand corner, this is AO1 information, so we're looking at your knowledge and your understanding here, and we need to start by looking at, well, this is a mental health disorder, and much like other disorders you might look at in Unit 4, PSYA 4, you need to look at how that's diagnosed and kind of classified, and you'll either be looking at depression, schizophrenia, phobias or OCD in Unit 4. But here we need to look at the eating disorders, and how would you decide whether one person has an eating disorder or doesn't. That is decided, as I say, by the DSM, and actually it will depend on which textbook you're looking at here. The DSM IVTR, which is the DSM 4 text revision, DSM obviously standing for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. So this is the book that psychologists use to diagnose any mental health disorder. So yeah, lots of the A-level textbooks look at the DSM 4TR because that's what was published when the textbooks were published. But actually since then, in 2013, the DSM-5 has come out, DSM-V, and there were slight changes made to lots of disorders actually, and eating disorders included in that, so I'll take you through what that is at the end. But what's continued and what's the same? Well, obviously, anorexia is seen as, maybe not so obviously, but anorexia is seen as an anxiety disorder. So this is talking about kind of excessive fears, and we're talking here about being fat, being overweight, weight gain, and actual fear of putting on that weight. So again, like phobias and OCD, it's categorised under the anxiety disorder side of the DSM. As well as that, one of the criteria and one of the classifications, one way to determine whether someone has anorexia or not, is if they are 85% of what's considered normal weight for their age. People with anorexia tend to want to exert excessive control over their weight and over their eating, so they would use things such as over-exercising, laxatives, massively restricting food intake. All of these things will lead to that loss of weight. And there's BMI, body mass index. If that's less than 15.5, that tends to be an indication as well of having anorexia nervosa. And then finally, and this is probably the big bit and the psychological side of it, I guess, but it's this body image distortion. They see themselves as being fatter than they actually are. They'll always see themselves as being overweight when in fact to an objective observer they're not overweight at all, but they themselves see themselves as being bigger than they are, and that's actually explained or demonstrated in that picture that I've got at the bottom of that slide. The criteria that was taken out is That's wrong. the criteria that was taken out is anorexia, which is the cessation of periods in girls, and that was actually taken out because obviously that's quite specific, and actually a lot of the people with eating disorders it wouldn't relate to. So maybe girls that haven't reached the stage of having periods yet, or women that have gone past that stage, so gone through the menopause. It wouldn't apply to them, obviously. Females on the contraceptive pill, it wouldn't really apply to them either. And obviously males, it wouldn't apply to. So that there are a few classifications of people that actually could potentially have an eating disorder or have anorexia, that part of the classification wouldn't relate to, and so that's the justification of not including it. So that's your basic of the DSM and how to actually classify this disorder. What we'll go on to look at now then is some actual psychological explanations of how someone may get this disorder. Okay, so the first two psychological explanations we're going to look at, which could have an influence in acquiring anorexia, are culture and the media. So taking culture first, it's a widely held belief that anorexia is actually quite a Western idea, and that in Western cultures, body image, body satisfaction is promoted with thinness and a thin ideal, and this was supported by research by Gregory et al., who found that 16% of 15 to 18-year-old girls in the UK were currently on a diet. So that shows quite an awareness of kind of wanting to change their body image, and maybe that could obviously end up transpiring and leading into body dissatisfaction, and so therefore anorexia, in reaction to societal and cultural norms. This obviously links in with the idea of the media. So if that is the norm in the culture, then what you'll find is that ideals, body ideals, thin ideals, are portrayed and promoted on television and in magazines, and that is picked up within the culture. And what has been found is that those who have got low self-esteem due to their body image are more likely to compare themselves to these thin ideals that they see on TV and in magazines, and that was found in Jones and Buckingham. Another, what I find really interesting study is by Becker et al. In 2002, and this was where they looked at girls in Fiji in 1995. And what happened then is TV was first introduced, because obviously looking at islands, it's a bit later than maybe some other countries around the world, and they were able to study there the changes in body image and ideas that came about after these westernized television shows were shown with obviously these thin ideals. And what they found was that, yeah, indeed, these girls, these young girls, saw these images being portrayed in the media, and they then felt that they had to follow those ideals, and change their idea of their ideal body image. So both of the culture and the media together, you can see having an impact on maybe the development of anorexia nervosa. Other psychological factors that can be seen to influence anorexia are ethnicity and peer influence as well. So when we talk about ethnicity, what we're saying is that it tends to be that anorexia seems to be quite a white Western problem. So white Western, and actually, as we've already mentioned before, females, so white Western girls tend to be much more affected by this disorder than other groups. And so what you find is that in non-Western societies and in black cultures and societies, there's a lot lower levels of anorexia nervosa than in white Western cultures. This has been backed up by research. Grabe and Hyde conducted a 98 study meta-analysis, and hopefully you know what a meta-analysis is. It looks at lots of other studies, so that's quite a big meta-analysis. And what they found, they were comparing the differences in ethnicity and incidence of anorexia nervosa. And what they found was that there was a lot less body dissatisfaction in African American girls than there were in Caucasian and Hispanic. So that backs up the idea that ethnicity has a role to play in anorexia. What's also been found is that in other ethnicities, such as in Fiji and in the Caribbean, there's actually a positive attitude to bigger body types. So that shows that it could be this cultural thing, this ethnic ideals and ethnic norms, what's considered attractive and what's considered normal in that culture and in that ethnicity can have an effect on individuals, and obviously these girls in those situations in Fiji and the Caribbean, we can see from the Polak study there, the larger body type is seen as being attractive, being fertile, being well fed. So there are positive connotations put onto that, whereas in white Western cultures, that's not quite not quite seen. Peer influences are obviously another factor that can have a big role to play, and this is both for boys and girls. So what has been found has that boys and girls are teased by their same sex and by the opposite sex if they don't fit into these ideals. So again, in white Western cultures, girls are meant to be skinny and thin, and if they're not, they'll be teased by that. And actually, boys are meant to be seen as bigger and muscly, and again, if they're thinner, then they're teased by that as well. And so it's this gender-based identity, these gender-based roles that are kind of the expectations of children in these societies that can have an influence to play as well. That was Jones and Crawford found that. And what's also been found, the role of peer influence, is that it tends to be whatever happens, what the way that your friends and the way that friends of people deal with kind of weight issues and body dissatisfaction, that can have an influence as well. I guess it's almost social learning. So dieting among friends can be linked to unhealthy weight control. So pills and purging behaviours might kind of spread among different groups. And I guess those pictures at the bottom are meant to show the difference in ethnicity. Lots of white Western females seen as having this ideal, which has obviously led to anorexia later on. A further factor which could then influence the onset of anorexia nervosa is personality. Now, when we talk about personality, what we're talking about is a specific set of traits that are similar to all people who are said to have that personality type. So, for example, an extrovert tends to be outgoing, likes company of others, whereas an introvert tends to be more within themselves and prefers their own company. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about personality types. There have actually been two personality types that have been said to link to anorexia nervosa. The first of those is perfectionism. Now, the definition of a perfectionist or a perfectionism type personality are those who have high control, who would be intolerable of mistakes. Everything has to be done to the letter. They would repeat it if it wasn't done correctly the first time. That's what we're talking about when we say a perfectionist or perfectionism personality type. And it's been found that those with anorexia nervosa do have this perfectionism. And when people have been assessed, so this is the Strober et al. Study, they assessed people who are being treated for anorexia nervosa retrospectively, so that means after the diagnosis, but still they assessed people with anorexia nervosa for personality types and found that 73% of the girls who have anorexia have perfectionism and 50% of the boys. So that shows very high levels of perfectionism. There seems to be this association between doing things right, having control, it being intolerable of mistakes, and the eating disorder of anorexia. And if you think about the two, that does make sense, doesn't it? Being perfect over body type and control over what they put into their body, that makes sense that the two go together. It's worth noting, and we'll come back to this when we evaluate though, there is no cause and effect there. We don't know whether the perfectionism is causing the anorexia or the anorexia is causing the perfectionism, but that's just something to bear in mind. It's a link, it's an association at the moment rather than cause and effect. A second personality type that's been linked to anorexia is impulsiveness. Now, this personality trait has been linked to reacting very quickly to things, doing things off the cuff, not really thinking, going for something straight away. And that has actually been linked with anorexia as well. So, an impulsiveness personality type has been linked to anorexia. So, that was Butler and Montgomery. And what they gave participants a task to do and recorded how quickly they responded to the task. And they compared a group with anorexia nervosa, participants with anorexia nervosa, against a group without anorexia, and so that was the control group. And what they found was that the anorexia group responded really, really quickly, rapid response. So they had this impulsiveness compared to the control group. The fact that they were doing it quickly didn't necessarily mean they were doing it right, and actually what they found is that they were responding quickly and inaccurately, so their responses weren't actually correct. And so again, there's that link between this personality type, impulsiveness, and anorexia. That one's a bit harder to explain. I guess perfectionism does make sense. It'd be hard to say, well, why being impulsive? Why does that have a link? But again, that's something we'll look at evaluating and looking at the cause and effect there as well. Okay, and the final thing that we'll look at, the final psychological explanation for anorexia, is the psychoanalytic. And actually this is probably one of the most important theories, and this was developed by a researcher called Hild Bruch, and Bruch came up with a theory to say why some people would have anorexia, and base that on obviously psychoanalytic theory. And as with most psychoanalytic theories, this starts in childhood. So they said, Bruch said it was these childhood experiences that would lead later in life, would lead people to having this eating disorder. And so actually, when we talk about childhood, obviously the influence of the parents are very important. And what Bruch was saying, that it was due to ineffective parenting. Okay, so effective parents would be people that responded really well to their child. If the child was hungry and cried for being hungry, that parent would feed it. If they were needed winding, the parent would wind it. So just being an effective and attentive parent, that's obviously what an effective parent means. Ineffective parents obviously didn't do that, so it would be the opposite. It would be failing to respond to the needs of the child. So if the child is crying because it's hungry, they would pick it up and try to burp it. If it was crying because it was anxious, they would try to feed it. If it was crying because they needed comfort, they would try to give it comfort when it did need food. So that's ineffective parenting. Okay, and so what Bruch was saying, that this could later on, during childhood, this ineffective parenting could later lead on to anorexia. So the idea here is that these children of these ineffective parents, they would be confused. They would be very reliant on their parents to meet their needs, and they didn't obviously know whether their needs were going to be met or not, because obviously their parents would respond incorrectly to their needs quite often, and so there's this big reliance. And then what would happen, so that would obviously happen in childhood. Then going into adolescence, where people strive for a bit more autonomy and strive to be more independent, they can't do that because they've been so reliant on their parents. They couldn't, I don't know, hold down jobs on their own, or go off and live on their own if they needed to. And so what they would do, or what the theory says here, is that they would then turn to their body. They would turn to something that they can control. We all have control over what we put into our body, how much exercise we do, or how little we put into their body, in the case of anorexia. And so that's what Bruch was saying led to the disorder, that it was these ineffective parents in childhood, and during adolescence it would be the thing that they could control. And so they would control their body, but obviously to unhealthy amounts, because of this feeling of helplessness, where they can't control anything else. Okay, so that kind of rounds off each of the psychological explanations, and then we now need to go back to each of them because obviously this has all kind of been AO1, and we'll then look at evaluating our AO2, 3, and look at, right, what are the strengths and weaknesses of each of these different points. So in order to evaluate, we'll go back through each of the psychological theories for anorexia, and we'll look at whether there's any research that either supports or contradicts the approach as we looked at it before. So to begin with, we'll look at the theory to do with culture, and this suggested that it is a kind of a Western idea. Anorexia happens more in the West. Well, Hoke et al. Tested this, and they looked at the Caribbean island of Curacao, and the way that they investigated that, they looked at hospital records between 1987 and 1989, and they looked at all the admittance to hospital and looked at whether there was a similar level of anorexia in that society as you would find in other Western societies, because obviously if the theory says that it's a Western problem but we find this in other areas, yeah, at the same levels, that would go against it. And that's exactly what they found. Actually, they found around 6 cases of anorexia nervosa in the 44,000 people that were in the hospital, and that's around the similar levels that you would find in Western cultures. And so that actually goes against the idea of culture. That says, well, no, it's not just a Western thing. This seems to be happening across other countries as well. When it comes to the media, then, we looked before and we said, well, maybe the media has an effect on whether people develop anorexia or not. And the way we looked at that is we looked at the Becker et al. Study, and this is where TV was introduced in 1995. And we said that, well, yeah, after the TV was introduced, it was found that the Fijian girls were more likely to suffer from body dissatisfaction and more likely to have anorexia. Well, what's actually been found, and this kind of again goes against the idea of the media, is that if you put in place instructional intervention, so if you almost educate the people against the effects of the media before it happens or kind of while it's happening, that can kind of stop the effects happening. So what this is saying, this evaluates the idea of media, because what it's saying is it's not inevitable. So the media may have a role to play, but actually if there is this instructional intervention, you can reduce or prevent those effects happening. Next, we looked at ethnicity, and this was the idea that it was a white, not only Western as we looked at culture, but a white Caucasian issue, was anorexia nervosa. So obviously ways to test that was to test Caucasian samples against samples of other ethnicities. The research we saw previous said there was a difference, but actually there can be found, such as Catchlin and Regan, contradictory research. So there has been research that has found actually there's no difference in the amount, the prevalence of anorexia in African American samples and Caucasian samples. So it's not a straightforward link to just say, yeah, it's just white Western women. Sometimes it seems to be, but sometimes there seems to be a similar levels in other ethnic groups as well. And actually, Roberts et al. Found that okay, there was some difference in the white samples in white populations, but that only seemed to be true in older adolescents, and I don't think we quite understand yet why that might be, that you find an ethnic difference in older samples but not in the younger samples. So those studies kind of go against the idea of ethnicity. They're kind of contradictions to the idea that ethnicity is a cause of anorexia. Next, we looked at peers and the role that peers play in people developing anorexia. There seems to be some supporting research, but also some contradictory research here. So Lund et al. Seems to support the idea that peers do have a role to play. What they found was a positive correlation between body mass index (BMI), so basically the denser people tend to be, and teasing. And they found this in both male and female, or boys and girls. So that would suggest that, yeah, their peers do seem to bully and tease those with a bigger body mass index, and so again that would suggest why that some of those children would then control their weight, and that could lead to anorexia. However, Stroff and Thompson found that there doesn't seem to be this correlation in disturbed eating between friends. So again, if we said that friends had a role to play, you would expect what one group of friends does, the rest of the people in that group does, and you'd find a correlation there. But that hasn't been found. And so again, it's not this straightforward. There may be other things happening there, but it doesn't suggest that peers are the only thing that are having an influence on anorexia, although it does seem that they play some sort of a role here. We also looked at perfectionism as a personality type, and it seems to be a long found link now that yeah, people with anorexia do have this perfectionist personality, and we suggested why that might be, and it does seem to make sense. Supporting research by Nielsen et al. Seem to say that actually the duration is linked to perfectionism here. So what they found is the longer the anorexia, or the longer the person has suffered from anorexia, the higher levels of perfectionism have been detected through various tests. It could be questionnaires, for example. And so there does seem to be that link. This perfectionism and anorexia do have this direct link, and specifically in terms of duration, how long they've had the disorder. But again, there's cause and effect there. Is the longer duration of anorexia causing higher perfectionism, or is higher perfectionism causing longer durations of anorexia? And that's still a little bit of an unknown. And the final theory, psychological theory of anorexia that we looked at was the psychoanalytic, and we need to evaluate that, obviously. So remember, this was Bruch, and Bruch said that it was ineffective parents who end up having children who overly rely on their parents, and so as a way of controlling something, anything, because they feel they haven't got control over their lives, they control their body. And so that's the idea, that's the theory. So have we got any support, have we got any research that goes along with that? Well, yes, there does seem to be some research support for this. So Steiner et al. Observed and interviewed parents and their children, children who had anorexia nervosa, interviewed them and observed them with their parents. And what they found was that the parents, they're the ones that tended to define the needs of their children. It was the parents who seemed to be overbearing. So that supports the theory, that supports that they are being ineffective parents, it supports that they're not allowing their children control over the situation, and would suggest that they are then turning to their body as a way of having something to control. The parents claimed that they anticipated the needs of their children better than their children did, again supporting this idea that the children would then react by controlling their bodies. And they also, other research, Button and Warren, interviewed those with anorexia nervosa, and they did say they felt they had a lack of control over their lives, they worried about what others thought, they worried about others' views of them. And again, this supports the idea that it's these things and this thinking, potentially caused by their parents, that is leading to the disorder. So that does seem to be quite a substantial approach to. And probably the main one, this does come up in the mark schemes when you start looking at the exam questions on the psychological explanation of anorexia. The psychoanalytic one does come up in Bruch, and so that's a good one to know, and obviously a good one to know some evaluations and this supporting research of. Final things then, obviously, as it's PSYA3, we need to look at issues, debates and approaches. And there are a couple of those. So the first one is ethics, and it's obviously quite a tricky area to study. Quite often people with anorexia want to hide their disorder. They won't want people knowing or interfering. And so it's quite tricky to then get these people to take part in research. So what's happened is researchers have kind of turned to the internet. There tends to be a lot of information on anorexia on the internet. These are known as pro-anorexia sites. And on these they have kind of discussion boards and forums and chat rooms and groups and all sorts. And so you can actually get a lot of information out of that as a researcher. It's really good as a researcher source of information. However, obviously you need to then take into account whether that is an ethical way to get information. Do these people actually know that the comments that they're making, the things that they're saying, are being taken part in this study, which raises BPS guidelines of kind of privacy, informed consent, confidentiality, etc. And so you need to be wary of these ethical considerations when looking at research into anorexia. So that's obviously one of the issues, debates and approaches. The second thing that's looked at is this has obviously got massive real world applications, and so one area is obviously the media, so that's something you can look at, and we can look at media, advertising, TV, magazines, and look at whether what they're doing actually has an effect in the real world. And well, the French seem to be kind of leading the way on this. They're obviously quite into their fashion and fashion and anorexia have obviously got a long history. And what's happened in France is this is an ongoing thing. So French advertising have agreed in the fashion industry to use a diverse range of body types in their advertising, kind of on the catwalks, in magazines, even down to mannequins in the shops. But this is still an ongoing thing. So even December 2015, so within this last year, the French government have passed bills that have banned excessively thin models, and companies can be fined for using them. They looked at doing this with BMI, but obviously that raises lots of questions, so it will be taken on a case-by-case basis. But companies that have been found to use what they've defined as excessively thin models, they will be fined. And so that's a real positive step, but it shows real world application. It shows all of this theory and research, the fact that they know that that media has an effect on individuals and can potentially contribute to the disorder. Well, that's definitely big real world application. Okay, so that's pretty much all you need. You've got your AO1, the different theories from kind of media, culture, ethnicity, peer relations, personality, and psychoanalytic, and then some evaluation of that, as well as obviously this IDA as well. So thank you very much for listening to this one. I will do the biological explanations as well. My standard thank you, obviously referencing to the textbook that I use. It's the Cara Flanagan and Mark Cardwell textbook, and the resource community who have given some information over to there. Subscribe to my channel, and you'll obviously get all of the videos on this topic, eating, as well as I've done aggression, and I've done playlists that I've got them all in there as well. Thank you very much for listening, and until next time, farewell.